8 Myths and Facts about Suicide and Depression. Depression and suicide facts. Depression is more common than AIDS, cancer, and diabetes combined, and nearly 400,000 people attempt suicide in the US every year. But even though it's a common and serious problem, many people don't know that much about depression and suicide, including who's at the greatest risk, why, and when they are most likely to be vulnerable. Here are 8 myths and facts about depression and suicide. 1. Suicides peak during holidays. Myth. There is a time of year when suicides are more common, says Marcia Wallenstein, MD, research scientist at the Department of Veterans Affairs Health Services Research and Development Service. But it's not when everyone thinks. Most people think the winter holidays are a risky time, but suicides are lowest in December and peak in the spring. It's not clear why, but it could be due to changing levels of natural light. It could be that they have more energy to attempt suicide, says Dr. Wallenstein, who is also an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Michigan Depression Center, in Ann Arbor. 2. Suicide rates climb with altitude. Fact. The greater the elevation of a person's home, the higher the risk of suicide, according to a recent study. Suicide rates are about 70% higher in regions 2,000 meters in elevation, for example, compared to at sea level. The effect appeared to hold even after researchers accounted for risk factors such as greater gun ownership and lower population density. 3. Teens are at greatest risk. Myth. Teenage suicides make headlines, but the elderly are more likely to take their own life than any other age group, says Dr. Wallenstein. At particularly high risk are white men over the age of 85, who have a suicide rate of 49.8 deaths per 100,000, compared with about 14 per 100,000 in people over 65, and 11 per 100,000 in the general population. Still, teenagers remain a high-risk group. 1 in 5 high school students says he or she has considered suicide in the past year, and 1 in 12 attempts to take his own life. The suicide rate for 15 to 19-year-olds is 6.9 per 100,000. 4 Whites attempt suicide more often than other races. Fact. Suicide is more common among whites in the US than blacks, Asians, or Hispanics. No one is quite sure why whites are at a higher risk, says Dr. Wallenstein. It might have to do with differences in social support. The only group at higher risk is American Indian, Alaskan Natives, who have a suicide rate of 14.3 per 100,000 compared to 13.5 per 100,000 for whites and about 5 to 6 per 100,000 for other groups. 5 Writing style is linked to suicide risk. Fact. Creativity, depression, and suicide have long been linked, so it may come as no surprise that some of history's most creative individuals suffered from a mental illness. Depression affected great minds such as Charles Dickens, John Keats, and Tennessee Williams. Several famous writers have committed suicide, including Ernest Hemingway, Sylvia Plath, and David Foster Wallace. This group also has something else in common: they all wrote in the first person, which has been suggested to be a sign of suicide risk. 6 Depression is always the cause of suicide. Myth. 2 of every 3 people who commit suicide are depressed at the time they take their life. However, alcoholism plays a role in 1 in 3 completed suicides. Major depression is the psychiatric diagnosis most commonly associated with suicide, with about 20 times the risk found in the general population. With much more active screening and treatment, depression carries less of a stigma now, but it remains one of the big risk factors for suicide, says Dr. Wallenstein. 7 Poor countries have higher suicide rates. Myth. In fact, many rich countries have higher suicide rates than developing nations. Some of the lowest rates can be found in Latin American countries, such as Brazil and the Dominican Republic, while richer countries, based on their GDP per capita, such as Russia, Japan, and France, are among the highest. These nations report numbers between 2 and 3 times as high as the US. Approximately 54 of every 100,000 men in Russia, for example, commit suicide every year. The region's high rates of alcohol consumption may be partly to blame. 8 Most suicide attempts fail. Fact. Fortunately, only 1 in every 10 to 25 attempts actually results in death, according to Dr. Valenstein. To further lower that rate, Dr. Valenstein suggests taking away the means. Make sure people you're concerned about don't have stockpiles of meds or access to guns, she says. You want to make it difficult for them to enact a persistent suicidal thought.